drink coffee on.
Okay, so I'm here with Richard Parris from Saito. Richard, how are you?
Good. Nice, clear, crisp morning here in Japan. So,
Awesome, awesome.
yeah.
So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you're working on right now? Like, what is Saito exactly?
Yep. So, Saito is a wholly new blockchain protocol, new chain configuration and consensus mechanism. So we're based in Beijing. My co-founder, David Lancashire, who's really the kind of the progenitor of the ideas, started talking to me about this, I think, early to mid 2017. 2017 August, he actually filed a patent. So he was put a marker in the sand to say where things were at. And during that time, he'd started talking to me about solutions on some of the mathematical issues and modeling and so forth for how we could actually bring all these ideas together in code.
Mm-hmm.
So I sort of got more and more involved over the end of 2017, came on board full time, really the sort of Marchish 2018, and I've been co-founder on the project since. So in that time, since then, we've gone from a very early prototype with a lot of the hallmarks of prototypes in it to a much more solid version now, a testnet. It's it's solid, and it can do about 1% of the throughput we think the network can aspire to with some more development and some proper hardware behind it. But it demonstrates, I think, that you can take the ideas behind Saito and build code that works and build them into a chain that has the properties that we need to see, really, to start looking at actual massive on-chain scaling and some Web 3.0 things that I think we'll get into as well later on in the discussion. So we're now sort of moving into having our testnet up lightly. So getting more and more people to start looking at that and playing with that. How do we move forward now from here? How do we get the ideas more into the space, and how do we start working with the community to sort of build up growth, etc.? So that's really where we are now in a nutshell.
Okay, so what practical problems does Saito solve exactly for end users? I mean,
for end users, it's scale. So the big thing with Saito as a blockchain is that because we've attacked scaling at the economics, the fundamental level, it essentially turns scaling into a funding problem. If people are prepared to pay for the bandwidth, then suppliers get rewarded for that, for providing the bandwidth on the network. That means developers have a chain which is much more like an interactive API. It's a public PKI network with broadcasting.
mm-hmm.
So that means anybody can find anybody else on the network, just like a Bitcoin transaction.
Okay.
And it has security built in. These are things that the internet does not have and that force us to go via trusted third parties. And this gives us untrusted networking, which means, for instance, I'm perfectly happy sending myself my Bitcoin private keys across a secured Saito email type transaction.
Okay.
Because I know fundamentally it's as secure as the cryptography that underlies it. It's as secure as Bitcoin. So it's as likely you can crack my Saito mail message as it is you can actually just brute force my Bitcoin key.
Right.
At the same time, I can do that without messing about. If I have a device and I want to send up something sensitive to another device, it's a couple of clicks and I've secured them across the blockchain with each other. And importantly, it's Diffie-Hellman across the blockchain. There's no third party involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
So then at the moment, when you ask sort of what does it solve for users, initially this is a question for developers, because users are community members who are giving it a go because they're early adopters and they like to see things online and on chain working. Long term, I think it really comes down to the answer to that is, what can you do with Web 3.0? What do we want to do with Web 3.0 that's going to make a difference to people? And those things will be many and varied, both to do with disrupting and really pulling out the payment channel middlemen
mm-hmm.
that centralize the internet. So a lot of models where we can then just blow away the Google, Facebook consolidated content and advertising lock that they have. So a great example would be something like this YouTube channel. You know, it's going out over YouTube because honestly, for an audience, that's what we've got to do these days.
Yeah.
But with the sorts of things that we're envisaging, what you could do is users would bring their own advertising, which sounds a bit odd at the moment, but basically users could subscribe to advertising in a light or heavy way, simply by clicking on it or not clicking on it. So your site would just have receptors for that. And you could monetize your channel simply by saying, to watch these videos, I'll split the advertising content revenue with you, user. Mm-hmm. So it's between you and the user, nobody else involved in that. Right. And we can do that because it's on-chain transactions with real keys, with real identities online. So I might get $5 for the fact that they know I'm a Bitcoin type, so they've got an avatar, a wallet or something on the side. And because it's directed and it's very, very, targeted advertising, the payout's quite big. And because we're not splitting 90% of it with Google, right, that's probably going to be a significant monetization of a view for you.
Right.
So I think done well, we won't see this thing where it's like, oh, I can tell I'm on Web 3.0. Look, it's all different. It won't feel different at all. The difference will be the content and the access to things you hadn't expected, because it's not running in line with what is, focus group the hell out of it, Facebook HQ, or, within the guidelines of Google or anything. It's just you and me chatting. And if there's right. 10 people who like to hear you, or 1,000 or 100,000, you've got a monetization model on that. Similarly, because of the both the increased income and the freedom to not have to bend over for Apple, etc. App developers have a myriad of business models now, because they can just put their apps up on distributed app stores wherever they like. They can sign them with keys. So if you could still have aggregators. So if Sally Wu is a fantastic trendsetter, and she just gets at what people are going to want out of new mobile applications, etc. She can set up a very successful site herself, where she has a simple term of service for developers, where you send me your signed application, right? And we'll do a revenue split of X, right? And all the things you've got now, she can promote stuff, she can do reviews, and they can have different business models behind them. The main thing is, Frankie Schornstein can do the same thing, and whoever's got an audience, whoever's providing a good service to people, can do that. And that could be incredibly small. It could be for, left-handed altcoiners in Quebec, right. Or it could be global. It doesn't matter. And the other big thing with what Saito's doing is, because this stuff is on chain and it's driven heavily on chain, the hosting is actually very light. So it's very, very quick to get stuff up on chain. And it gives people a lot fewer barriers between, oh, okay, so, I've got this great idea. We're going to get an audience. We know it, but we've got to go and find credit cards, which we might not be able to do if we're not, first worlders. Get an AWS contract or a DigitalOcean contract, abide by all of their terms and services, et cetera, which might be confusing for us and difficult if we're not, stationed where they expect us to be. And all of those things just to get our website up. Whereas with Saito, you could post essentially ads and sites, again, signed onto the chain, so they can work that way. Mm-hmm. Now, you might want to split up the hosting and do stuff differently on and off chain later if you're getting an audience, but these are options that you have, and so there's no real friction to getting started. And I think we've been really pushing hard to make sure that's all possible, because that's what the kind of hope for Web 3.0 is for me, is we won't have designed it, we'll just make it possible. Right. And Jack Liu, good friend and sometimes advisor to the project, we were at dinner in Hong Kong one night, and he said, you know what? He said, what we're going to see is one day, on-chain transactions will treble, and we'll have no idea why. And we'll go and we'll look through the keys and things, and we'll send a message to a private key, say, hey, who are you? What are you doing? And we'll get a message back from a 13-year-old in Ghana or something. He said, oh, I made whatever it is. And we will never have seen it coming. And that's really cool, because that's how the internet was early days. things weren't bandwidth intensive, and people were very tolerant of waiting, I suppose, back then as well. But
Mhm.
things just popped up. You'd go into an office and you'd be looking at someone's screen. What is that? Oh, it's Mosaic. Oh, what does that do? And we haven't had that for a while. Things are getting nicer and slicker, and web design's really great. But we're not. I haven't had that sense of wonder in a while since I first saw monetary transactions on blockchain, I think.
Right. So I guess, I'm wondering, because Saito sounds a lot like a basic fundamental infrastructure technology that will enable messaging like email and social media and all this stuff. So I'm wondering, how would you differentiate Saito from another technology like IPFS, for example?
So there's a couple of big differences. The main thing is that everything is on chain or can be on chain.
Mm-hmm.
So the big difference there is that IPFS is putting a lot of things off chain and using chains for sort of sub purposes on there, for which you could swap Saito in if you wanted to. The biggest difference, I think, is that in the end you're going to have problems with IPFS's long-term stability. Just in terms of the model isn't there quite to pay for mass usage. To have it's going to keep working if, for instance, people like me, are interested and will put things, will add as much as they take,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But there isn't, I think, a good enough model for paying people on the network to provide that data, and there isn't a model for putting it into a marketplace such that there's a way of deciding what sticks around and what doesn't, which
Mm-hmm.
causes infinite storage issues.
Right.
So, I mean, the basic premise behind Saito is that in the end, everything falls into an economic equilibrium. So a big concept we have is a transient blockchain. Blockchain is not permanent. Now, that freaks a lot of people out. But when you think about it, when you look at how we do it, you can have permanent things on a transient chain.
Mm-hmm.
They just have to pay to stay on.
Right.
So we have automatic rebroadcasting where the consensus must put something back on chain if it meets certain criteria. So, for instance, if you have a lot of money in a transaction, and that automatic rebroadcasting becomes more and more expensive, or you could manually just resend the information.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is, with a certain amount of new data coming into the network, if you have a certain amount of data falling off, then the price will just be at a point where you've got to work out with the existing data and the new data, what is the appropriate price point. Now, it sounds a bit sort of draconian to say, well, you've got to pay to stay on. Of course you do. Otherwise, you have something that's akin to a pension system where no one ever dies. I retire at 65 and I'm like, well, great, I've done my work, I've paid my way. Everybody else is going to pay for me forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's an issue. It's not that that's not solvable on IPFS, but they haven't done that yet.
Right.
And so what we've got is something that's, I think, a more advanced version of something like Ether considering with rent, where there's a way of saying, I value this, I want it to stick around, or no, that was just that was a handshake between two key pairs I don't even have anymore. I don't care. Or that was a broadcast to say what my IP address was from my phone back in 2019. Who cares? Like, I really don't need to keep that on chain. Versus, I put my will on chain, so I'd like it to be circulating for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll add a stipend to it. I can actually put some tokens in that transaction, just keep it going round and round and round if I happen not to do that myself.
Mm-hmm.
That to me creates stability, because we know that the chain is actually funded. It's appropriately funded for the amount of storage it requires. If storage costs become cheaper, then the chain can grow, because it will cost less to keep the same amount of data on, or the same amount to keep more. Similarly, if there's an increase in fees available, so people are valuing this more and they want to put their data on the chain more, then the chain will also be able to sustain more, because it will be able overall to purchase more storage.
Right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm really interested in, that I've kind of been thinking a lot about a lot recently, is this idea of, a new model for incentivizing content creators or developers or anybody who produces digital information that's valuable to contribute it to the network and get remunerated for it. So kind of what I've been thinking about is this idea of using something like Saito or IPFS to essentially issue rewards to people who share files that become highly propagated across the network. So let's say this video goes viral and 80 million nodes on the Saito network replicate this video. The blockchain could have some visibility on that and then issue me a reward for having contributed this video or something like that. Or let's say that a developer finds a bug in the Saito client and issues a patch that then a lot of developers approve, and then it propagates the network. That developer could also be issued a reward for having that patch propagate across the whole network. So instead of necessarily asking people to pay to store their content on the network, maybe we could flip it around and actually pay people to share their content.
No, I think that's, to me, like, that all sounds like, oh, how's that going to work, until you tie it to what we were talking about before with advertising, right? When these payments are frictionless and they're coming out of a wallet that's in your browser anyway, that's just accruing, it's not going to be a huge amount of money. Maybe it'll be $15. But when I get your patch, I already agreed when I subscribed that patches get paid, right? Like half a cent or something, right? But the point is that you take half a cent from 10 million people, nobody notices.
Right.
Or 0.005 cents or something like that. And we're all happy about it because we're getting this great service. Right? So yes, absolutely. That's exactly the kind of thing that we're looking at. So we go back to the model we had before, where, again, we're decentralized. So there aren't necessarily official this and official that. We might have an official Saito client to get people started and to let people know the old school, in the old way, that it's trustable because we've stamped it with trust. But in reality, what we want is people can just develop Saito clients, and maybe your Saito client has a low set of features, mad security, and a really great guarantee on those kind of bug fixes coming out quickly. And you charge a bit more for it, and you have a niche client base. And when you release a patch, that's taken into account and that goes straight to you. When somebody else releases a patch for your client and you vet it, you've got an agreement in place that splits up the payments on that. Or I can use, Fast Ricky's Saito client, which gets every feature now, but I better be aware it's really alpha and it crashes and occasionally might lose stuff. But I'm just using it on test rigs because I want to see the new things that are coming up. Right? In which case, I have a different model. And maybe people are donating time on that because it's really a developer playground to check out what's going on. So both are possible, and of course the spectrum is possible. So there might be another Saito client that's very similar to yours and forked from yours, but where it's got some other features. It's got it's integrated with other things as well. So, and they can you can have a model where you get remunerated for the people using your base layer in their bigger client that I don't know what it is, Saito for cars or something, and they grab your wallet and they put it in there. So I think you can do very similar things with content distribution, where you could say, because that's a great question. People say, well, okay, so that's nice, Richard. You've got this model I described earlier of George puts up his video. And we've got this subscriber model and everything, great, but who the hell's hosting it? And we could do exactly the same thing that you're suggesting. We can do something very like storage or IPFS, where you agree to split the payment with the provider of the file. So I actually stream it from someone down the road from me, and I can use the combination of the chain and other data, so I can actually broadcast to the chain, I want file stamp X. And I'm here, or vice versa. just send me replies, and I will pick someone that's close with good latency, and I'll pull the file directly from them, and they're going to get paid for providing that file. And again, that can be an agreement between you and those people. So when you take your cut of the advertising from me on the site, we just funnel a part of that to the infrastructure provider. So if someone's doing something like storing, large files that you don't want on chain, like a video that's an hour and something long, absolutely, you can do all of that. But I think the key there is that it's going to be really hard if I have a wallet I need to top up every time I want to go and do something. Whereas if you've got a feed of incoming revenue, like we have, the internet clearly pays for itself now, because you can go and look at Google HQ and Facebook HQ and Tencent HQ and see just how much money these guys have.
Right.
So clearly the internet has enough inbound funds to pay for all this infrastructure. It's just a question of how do we organize it without those titanic great big companies in the middle. And so if you're, and again, going back to it, the model, if I'm in an area where, hey, I'm in a rural town somewhere, I can actually try and be responsive to what the people in my community want and provide the service off one local server. Just, I've got the best bandwidth in town. I can run this as a service and make some money. If I'm in a big urban center, probably there's just going to be some big semi-professional units running this on the back of things like AWS. Why not? And if that's going to provide a good result to people in Seattle, well, you're going to have a hard time beating AWS for the server providing. The difference is that the service is not tracking me. It's just someone I have a direct agreement with. I can quite simply say, look, I don't want to deal with that person. Like, I don't like their policy or something else. I'm just not going to take files from them. I don't want them getting paid for what I do. I'm going to take my dollar elsewhere. And we have that complete freedom in that model.
Cool. So what kind of applications are you guys currently building right now? Like what's actually working? What stage are you in development?
So, the latest thing we've built is always the thing we're most excited about. We have our original, like our first demonstration applications were all about showing people that what I've been talking to you about isn't some kind of pipe dream. So we've actually built a little model village as such of applications that actually work and include ad funding of interactions. So if you go onto testnet now and you want to send a message, you'll need tokens, but you can get those tokens either. We do have a faucet just to make that simple if you want to click a button, but there are little ads that are running off our own ad server. Now they're usually a penguin or something that just smiles at you. They're not, we're not actually spooking anything. We're just demonstrating the whole thing works. So you can actually go and play on testnet or use testnet in full force actually if you want to. And have it ad supported. So we started off with just a set of things to model what can you do. So something that is a simple email client. We have a chat client. We have what we call Dreadit, distributed Reddit, just to show you can build. And that's quite a traditional application in that the actual content is stored in a database on a server. The difference is the way you get your content there is on chain. So essentially you could have different people running different Reddits that subscribe to different incoming sets of messages on the chain and display those. We have a Facebook clone, and these and then sort of the ad module and other things you can go and test. Those original ones are really there to show, look, this Web 3.0 idea isn't pie in the sky. It's just that you need to have the right kind of infrastructure underneath it, and you need to do things like get rid of limits to the size of messages to be able to let developers to really program and not get stuck in DApp hell.
Right.
But then recently we've also been having fun putting some games together. And again, this is to demonstrate that you can do this sort of thing totally distributed. So a couple that we have, one is just chess. I just found a JavaScript chess engine and put it online just so that you can see, oh, you can actually use this to send the moves across the chain. in the end, that may not be, obviously there are lots of ways to play chess online. The main thing is it's also if you're a developer and you're interested in putting something like that together, having a look at the chess module is a really simple, great way to understand, this is quite easy to program. A skilled developer could take the chess I put together and put together checkers in an hour or two. Mm-hmm. What my co-founder David did that's really very impressive and cool from a kind of geeky standpoint, as well as from actually using it, is a demonstration of the first few moves of a very popular board game called Twilight Struggle. So it's not the full game, it's just to show you can do it. But it involves doing a few things like mental poker, mm-hmm. which is a way, it's important because that's a way of anonymously and secretly dealing cards in a non-cheatable way without a central authority. And again, we're all about making sure you can do things without having to just revert back that one time and kind of undo all the good. So it's just a clever way of essentially, I encrypt a deck of cards, hand it to you, you shuffle it and then encrypt it, hand it back to me, I pull my encryption and shuffle it. And by the time we've finished all of this, essentially when you want to pull a card, I have to you give me its ID, we don't know what it is, I give you the key that I have for that, you can unencrypt it so you know what card that was and I don't. Mm-hmm. Now that's not a huge deal in and of itself, like for playing cards, but it is fully decentralized. And in fact, the method was invented by the RSA team mm-hmm. In the 70s. And the nice little bit in the paper when we found it, we read it, was they said it's basically implausible that anyone will ever do this because it's too computationally difficult. So right. 40 years on, and with a chain, we can do it. We can do it fully anonymously, very simply. Well, it wasn't that simple, but it's very doable. And this, for games, obviously games are triviality, but this gives us a real demonstration that you can do complex, things that you'll need for things like fintech and contracts and other, sort of more complicated collaborative things without these centralized authorities. You really can. Mm-hmm. It can involve a few offline, off-chain or on-chain transactions, depending on which way you want to do it. But there are ways of saying, let's completely avoid centralization. Mm-hmm. Again, it would be very easy to put that game together if you just have a server that you trust and that just shuffles the deck and hands you cards one by one. Right. But what we put together is a provably secure way of doing that using cryptography. Mm-hmm. That could be then repurposed not just for card deals, but for auctions and for all sorts of other, lotteries where you need to be fair online. Mm-hmm. Just little things about who gets to go first in an auction or something like that, where there's an advantage and you want to make sure that you can demonstrate that, afterwards you can fully audit the fact that you did pull the highest card in the deck, essentially, so that you got first slot and that was fair. Right. And those things will be really important for, the kind of fintech and contractual legal things people want to start doing on chain, where you need to have exactly that kind of scenario. So we need to bid in order. So the bidding order is important. So we'll have to, make sure we have a way of doing that again that can be run autonomously and doesn't require that central authority that we're trying to avoid.
Right. So, that's really interesting, because for people in our community, the benefits of decentralization are clear in that it's just more transparent and it's more fair, it's more equitable. But for the average person that really has no idea how these technologies actually work, all that they are really able to observe is that their Web 2.0 services, like you said earlier, are very well designed and they work pretty well. And so what I'm wondering is, who has a financial interest right now, in your opinion, in funding these types of technologies to compete or to essentially disintermediate the Web 2.0 industry? Like who's interested in funding this, and how would those people get their money back?
This is in some ways a classic 0 to 1 type problem. Like everything I've been describing, sure, if you've got an active, complete kind of advertising ecosystem to provide this money, then hey, obviously that's going to work. And if you look at how Saito works, you can see that because the routing nodes themselves are paid by the consensus mechanism, they will end up having tokens that they will then want to sell to advertisers who are getting their revenue from the same customers they get their money from now. And we have a functioning economic model that hopefully flywheels and gets stronger and stronger. But how do you start that? And that is a really good question. So things we're looking at, for instance, now is one of the reasons we're doing games is you can see as soon as you start building games the way we're doing, that for board game developers, online is a really big challenge. And also just making board games, for instance, because people buy a copy of Monopoly and then they play it for 30 years and it sits in the cabin or the beach house or the living room or wherever and just gets played when it gets played. And there's not really an incentive to like subscribe or get an upgrade kit or anything. So being able to do things in the model we've been talking about where people can play, they could micropayment per turn. Right? You could have very simple ways of doing it. And also with full disintermediation, you get the ability to actually invent slightly new kinds of play, etc. So there's a little, I mean, that's not a huge industry. There's a little example of the kind of place where there is currently an underserviced sphere in the Web 2.0 area. I think we will see fintech stuff is another place where we'll see people moving in this direction. And again, it's interesting. I've had this conversation a few times recently. Maybe it's coming home having picked up some funding and me being the person that's responsible for the project's private keys. It's just stressful. And I don't think I want my parents being their own bank. Like it's hard work. You've got pitfalls. You really need to understand what you're doing, and you can send all your money into the void by doing certain silly things. Similarly, corporates have a lot of trouble with things like custodial issues. So banks actually do provide a service to a corporate in that they have a process that matches what the corporate needs to do when, say, someone who had access to the bank account leaves. So there's a simple way of you inform them, Albert's no longer in finance, and they sort that out for you. And I think actually what we'll see is small players like these new kind of mini banks and stuff, realizing you can do things with private keys where you can offer people no lock-in, etc. So what I would want is to know that, for instance, my parents are banking with a capable service provider that's really providing services, which is the sort of thing I don't see. But they have private key level access. So if there's anything that they don't like about what's going on, they can simply pull their cash. Or if they want to call me or their accountant or someone and say, look, no, I want to take my money and put it over there, and I'm not happy with you putting restrictions on it for care of somebody else or what I can do with my money, they can then also just revert to an on-chain self-driven transaction if they want to. So to me, I think that's where we'll start seeing this sort of influx, is where people get something they want in a package that looks very, very similar to what they have now. So again, the way we would see our advertising module as working would be that you would just write it as a wrapper for a standard ad network. So if I run a blog and I run Google ads at the moment, what I would do is just add our advertising module and into that add my Google ads information. So what that would do is if the browser detects a Saito wallet inside the browser, it will use the Saito model. If it doesn't, it might or might not pop up a message of some sort to say, hey, you'd be getting way more money out of this if you were on board, but I'm going to show you the Google ads you're expecting. And everything continues on as normal. So that way you're not asking people to just jump into the void and completely switch in one hit. What they'll hopefully see is that the number of people using decentralized advertising on their site goes up and up and up as people realize the benefit of this to themselves. But I think we'll see a kind of people moving in from different angles in the industry, we won't see a, I don't know what we call it, head brochure or something. I'm trying to think of a Facebook pun. We won't see a competitor that just jumps in and does everything. What we'll see is a little piece taken off here and a little piece taken off there by people doing things for a specific group who they see, who have needs that are being ignored right now, or have desires that are being not met by these current things. It might even be that someone would set up something where you can be on Facebook and not. So you use the Facebook API to populate most of this application, but you can have crypto friends as well, and those things intermingle.
Right.
Because people don't want to have 19 things open, and or network effect is important. So I think that's how we'll see it. And that's really how we want to see it, because what we need is people to feel the benefits of decentralization and understand that I think what will be a rich textural difference in how things work when you understand that they're deregulated in a community basis. But when they still look as good and interact as simply as they do now, and people aren't going to give up what they have now for something that's really honestly crappy.
Right.
But decentralized, yay. I might, but we're not going to get mass adoption by doing that. So it'll be, I think, step by step, these small things. Like, for instance, your bank allowing you to have a Bitcoin balance as well, or your broker. And then people starting to say, well, eventually people saying, well, wait, why have I got a Bitcoin balance, but it's no different to fiat? Like the whole point is, where are my keys? Right.
Exactly.
And then hopefully the provider that's good about that and works out really good UX ways of dealing with your crypto within your bank account starts picking up more clients. And then hopefully people copy that, replicate that, improve that. And so that we start moving in the right direction. I don't think we'll see, we won't wake up in 2022 and be like, remember banks? It's not going to be that way. But hopefully a generation from now, people think it's as absurd to just hand your money over to a bank and hope that they let you do what you want with it, as we do that you would call a building to find out if someone's in it.
Exactly. Yeah. So one other question that I have, that I'm very kind of concerned about with these technologies is how do you plan to bootstrap content and services across this network? Like, for example, if I'm using the internet in its current iteration and I want to find something, I would use a search engine as kind of a centralized index of content on this network. So how would you propose to have, I guess, a decentralized index of content? And is that something that you guys are working on right now?
We're not working on that directly, but we're building things to allow for that, and where that makes sense is how we operate. So that is quite important. And essentially we need to stick with, again, it needs to be a smooth transition.
Right.
So there will be some people who go to dapps.com to look for dapps and will use dapps, even though what we're currently seeing is not that great in advance. But you're right. I mean, if I start using a decentralized method to put out content and I'm hoping to develop an audience, I better have some tools that let me get that in front of people. And realistically, at the moment, that means you'll have to be Google indexable. You can't require a client that's not in the browser, which is one reason we built things browser first. People need to be able to open things up and see them. Right? And that gives you access to realistically what the current options are. At the same time, I think, especially with the reward models you can build in, trusted aggregators will be more and more and more of a thing. So we can see that's already a thing. I mean, iTunes is just such a thing. The issue is that iTunes is a lowest common denominator, massive, oligopolist, which behaves very self-interestedly and rent seeks all over the place. So hopefully what we'll see is that, in fact, there is a reward for again, nuanced and thought through community specific or group specific aggregation.
Mm-hmm.
And people will come and trust that. So like a college radio station DJ that you like or whatever, I'm gonna follow this guy, except now it's a site or whatever. Still indexable, still searchable, but I can get that happening in a bunch of different ways.
Mm-hmm.
Like bands put out a shout out to that Landry guy who's got the great taste in music, and go and see what else he's recommending,
Mm-hmm.
because you're friends.
Right.
Similarly, you get to know like this and this content is available through this provider who's managing things like the kind of file storage systems you were talking about before for the artists who don't want to be bothered with that, and providing a simple browsable thing. But it might be targeted at just Brazilian suburban teens, or it might be Canadian law professors. I don't know.
Right.
It could be as big or small as it wants to be. So I think we'll see a shift then, as there's a real reward to that kind of curation and suggestion, and it's seamless. It's not a matter of I have to pay to subscribe to this, or the artist has to pay for that. If artists can set up a system where they have a pre-attached agreement to their content, so I will let you aggregate it on your site at this split. Right. So then anyone can pick it up, and vice versa. Sites have something similar, so you can just go on and say, here's the idea of my content stream.
Mm-hmm.
Please submit it through here, and then it's up to each site's operator and each content producer as to who they do and don't want to cooperate with. Whether that's just financial, or whether they're like, well, I don't like you guys. You have this other stuff on there that I find objectionable. I'm not going to let you do that. That's up to that's up to the individual. And we don't have these sort of overarching content things, but it needs to be a step-by-step process that takes people's current habits into account.
Right.
And so for us, building that base layer, it's not a matter of making that work. That's the product team with some skill and some elegance being able to execute that really well. For us, it's making sure that the chain really supports that, and we don't have the nightmare of Solidity development, needing to run in fewer nodes and all sorts of other things to get sort of really clunky versions of this up. We need to give developers the tools where they can, with some or little knowledge of the chain, they can just understand it like an API that behaves in a certain way that they can then develop, and they can make these stepwise refinements that people can start embedding pieces of this into their apps or their sites. And so that they get the advantages there, so they're obviously then motivated to push more in that direction, and users are also seeing something they hadn't had before and hopefully calling for more of it. And we kind of build from that way. Having said all of that, confidently, it is a real challenge to sort of get past the gatekeepers that we have now.
Right. Yeah, that is a huge challenge, because again, someone like Google doesn't necessarily have a huge financial interest in indexing decentralized content at the moment. It's not obvious to me how they would perceive that as being beneficial to them right now. Maybe there are some forward-thinking people on their team who would just think that it's better to be ahead of the game than to be behind it. But I think there's also it's also quite likely that they would fight tooth and nail just to slow it down as much as possible. So I wonder, because you mentioned earlier that you think that the user experience has to be as similar to the user experience right now, so that you can have a smooth transition. What do you think about the idea of building a browser for decentralized content? Because I know that Firefox, the team at Mozilla is supposedly, according to the IPFS newsletter, actually trying to implement some IPFS technology into Firefox right now. So what do you think about having a Saito browser or something like that, so that you could have a very similar user experience? to what people are used to.
Yep. I mean, I think the biggest issue there is, and this is, we've actually talked about exactly that, just forking a browser and adding these features in, and or we've built a Chrome plugin before to like add Saito features to Chrome that way.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things we've explored, and I think that's useful. And the biggest issue there is simply that when you're doing stuff decentralized, you are up for storing quite a bit more than you would have been if you're just leaving everything on server.
Right.
Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One way would be service providers will probably start providing essentially online endpoints. So something that's wrapped up for the end user, but where you can subscribe to essentially your cloud machine that's a browser that just pipes everything down to you, and it's on all the time, and it does various things. And I think that'll be a thing in the future. Because people will want to autonomously do things outside of having to store everything on their own device.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, so Berners-Lee's pods system, I think, is sort of a similar idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think that will come once people are already working in a decentralized way and happier that way. But they're not motivated to do it now. The only thing that worries me about a specialist browser is that it's friction for people.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have it, obviously it's going to feel just like an ordinary browser and do all sorts of wonderful stuff for you. The problem is getting people to take the leap. And the big problem really for us is making sure everything works in a standard browser right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably just that we may go the route of having a custom browser, and we do it hopefully in collaboration with someone. And what we simply have is Saito modules themselves say, hey, look, I'm running out of the tiny 5 meg of storage you have for me in browser right now. Go and get this upgraded chain-ready browser that's essentially exactly the same thing. It just has much more storage available on the local machine. And that's going to be, I think, a thing long-term. Similarly, I think there will be service providers that pop up and do backup and stuff like that for people, where you can basically just send along all of that content that you want to keep on in storage somewhere, so that you can restore and back up onto a new laptop and stuff. No one wants to go to a place where if you lose your laptop, you've lost your important correspondence, etc.
Right.
Again, what would be different is it's key driven, and the user is actually sovereign in that process. So the person storing the data simply has no idea what they're storing, because everything's encrypted from the get-go, and the keys give you, ownership and rights over that content directly. So it doesn't matter that it's on somebody else's hard drives. They're just giving you a convenient way of pulling and pushing that onto your browser, etc.
Right.
So I think that there are a bunch of technical concerns. Sorry, I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but there are a bunch of technical concerns around shifting. Like we say, it should be smooth and seamless for people, but there are technical issues like storage space and stuff around moving to being decentralized that particularly things like custom browsers would enable. And of course, in the long run, I hope that people just able to bring out a browser that doesn't support this kind of thing. That all the major browsers have blockchain ready, specifically Saito ready features to understand, what the light client is doing, how it stores things locally, and just makes it easier for developers.
Right. Okay. So another aspect of this type of technology that I'm very interested in is the censorship resistant aspects, right? So obviously both of us have spent time in mainland China, where, they have, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 people who work on censoring the internet, and they have the great big firewalls, the Great Firewall of China. And, what they don't necessarily censor because it's just too problematic, what they do is they might just add friction to make it, to lower the performance of foreign web services, and then, give kind of a competitive advantage to local service providers. And they definitely mess with the internet. And just from a basic human rights perspective, I mean, freedom of opinion, freedom to hold opinions and to share and express ideas through any medium, regardless of frontiers. I mean, this is a fundamental human right that China actually has agreed to, since they're a member of the UN. So, but in practice, the only technology that I've seen so far that really is very difficult to censor is a BitTorrent client that bootstraps torrents via magnet links over distributed hash tables like Kademlia or mainline DHT. You know, that'll have like 20 million peers over dynamic IP addresses. How do you guys plan? I mean, is censorship resistance something that you guys are concerned about? And how do you plan on tackling issues like that, like firewalls and you know, network filtering and friction and all of these issues, and you know, deep packet inspection and all of that? How do you plan on securing the technology, making it reliable in any market, and also making it safe for users to use this technology? Because obviously, you know, if a user, you know, on their home internet connection is constantly, it can be observed to be using an illegal network in China, that could be problematic for them. So how would you, is that something that you guys are tackling, and is that something that you guys have solutions to, or?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot to unpack there, because I think I hope we have a pretty nuanced set of thoughts about this, and this is actually really central to what we're doing. So, decentralization to me is in no small part just about essentially not trying to rely on any quick fixes at a personal or a state or any other level. So there are nasty people out there spreading nasty content, and we need to deal with that as a community, as a group of people.
Right.
At its root causes. We need to talk to each other and work out what's going on, not think that we can instruct Twitter to have a tighter terms of service on something and then that's actually ever going to work. So I'll get back onto that a little bit, but I think on your first point about like what could, say, a state actor do to block these things, everything and nothing. So there's two sides to this. One is that because a block's a block, and if you want anything in that block, you need to transmit the whole block. The difference is you end up, funnily enough, with a community response to things like a given player trying to block people's access, because it's all or nothing. So if you want the benefits of interacting with these other free nations, or whatever they are, open players, and those benefits are not insignificant, you have to take the whole package. Right? So we all have to get together and agree some common minimum. This doesn't mean you can't exclude certain players. If someone is using the network for something truly awful, it's up to everybody to work out exactly who they are and to not communicate with them. Just stop communicating with that group. So if someone's proposing terror or putting up other sorts of content that everyone on the network agrees shouldn't be there, right, then you just stop communicating with them. There's a possibility you'd end up with a bifurcated network. You'd end up with two chains because, you know, group A, B, and C will not ever talk to X, Y, and Z because they have such fundamentally different understandings of what's acceptable. But at least we're looking at something realistic there. And then you need to say to those two groups, look, how are we going to split this world up between us? Right? But you don't have this sort of thing where people can get a lot of the benefits and filter what they don't like or try to do that. So it's all or nothing. And I think that's really important because it's giving everyone every level sovereignty to do what they want. China could just block all internet traffic, but that's essentially what they'd have to do, and then they'd have to live with the consequences of having their own internet that doesn't interact at all. And clearly, that it's understood that would be a very bad idea right now because there is an internet connection. There's only so many points that can choke them off in a minute, and they've never done that. Obviously, big Chinese banks and enterprises would have severe problems if such a thing happened. So there's an awareness that that's not a good idea. How far that pushes is another thing. The other important thing about Saito, and this is really important to understand when it comes to these things, is that it's the transactions themselves that have value. Right? And so a USB stick full of transactions, right, has a price.
Mm-hmm.
So literally carrying one across the border would also work.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because someone can plug it into a machine somewhere else and broadcast those transactions.
Right.
And they will head out. So, and the difference between the internet is they will be able to route correctly. Right? So if I have a key that I want to just broadcast on, or I have a specific key I want to send secure messaging to, I can do those without needing to rely on any other pieces of infrastructure. So long as that data gets across any physical barrier, it's there. And it will create a market to do it. If I'm making good money smuggling messages across the border somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
There's an incentive for someone else to try and put up a sneaky microwave connection.
Right.
Or back end it through a satellite or something.
Right.
The difference is you don't have these quick fixes. You can't just turn off that internet and then, well, okay, now you don't have DNS, so you're screwed.
Right.
Right. Those sort of centralized pain points in the internet where you can just shut the whole thing down quite simply by blocking access to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's, the system you're talking about before is very robust unless you can sort of isolate someone for a moment and then they lose all of those dynamic IPs and how do they find them again?
Right.
So there are things you can do like blackout for an hour that really cause problems for that. And people would have to start phoning each other or doing something else to try and say, hey, look, here's an endpoint, hop on it quickly and start back up. Possible, but difficult. Same as, that's true of shipping USB sticks full of information. The point is it's I think combining that all or nothing with also having these kind of alternate ways that would be highly profitable to stay on the network. Do about as much as you can for censorship resistance. Eventually, as we've seen in China, compulsory spyware on phones, it's a thing. And if you go too far down that route, what you'll have is William Gibson-like scenarios where people know that you go to the basement in the shopping mall somewhere and the guy knows how to add further software that tricks the monitoring software into thinking you're harmless or whatever, and we'll have an escalation on those lines. But and a blockchain can't solve that issue. What we can do, I think, is again avoid these ideas and these temptations that there are simple all-in-one solutions to problems like bad actors, to problems like censorship, etc. Specifically as well for police forces, getting them away from the idea that, I can just throw out a digital dragnet, that'll work. And then suddenly there's an excuse for every single one of all of our communications to be monitored because of, petty crime and such. And that's we've seen that happening more and more. And to me, that's an important reason to ensure, both privacy and security for end users. Because the real problem there is if police forces just rely on these digital dragnets and so forth, they get institutionally lazy and expect to be able to do that. And if someone is subverting that, they're bulletproof now, because all of the techniques we have at a human level to isolate and find out who people are and to deal with that as a society just disappear, because it's just expected I can just scan for it, right? So to me, it's actually that level of censorship resistance and also privacy provision is important for things like state security, because if I'm not an expert on things like international security and what the services involved can do, etc. But I think from my reading of things, we did see in the 2000s and late 90s different nations stumbling hard because they'd gotten so used to their electronic surveillance and stuff just being, the killer way of doing stuff, that they totally missed things because they hadn't realized people were just talking or handing each other notes, or whatever, and they were, so secret services around the world were having to say, oh crap, we actually need people on the ground. We need to go and look good old fashioned infiltration,
Right.
and so to stop bad actors. And the same thing is true with drug cartels or any other kind of sort of unwanted activity or so forth. If a drug cartel is a dangerous, nasty thing, then the right way to stop it is actually find out who the people are and stop them doing the dangerous, nasty things they're doing, not just label them as something that's unsuitable and then sort of use bureaucratic methods to kind of put them in a box. Which to me, I think there's a whole interrelated set of important things going on right now around this space, where as we move to society occurring largely online, how do we actually refactor and keep the essentials of things like what is the digital version of habeas corpus, right? These kind of essential things that keep people free and make free countries different from ones where you're clearly not free. And then how do we also improve things? How do we take the extra capabilities that we have from the technologies we're building and actually make stuff better? So like, are there other ways of enabling behavior and disincentivizing negative action as groups,
right,
that we have access to because we've got better technologies and stuff to work together, rather than trying to apply sort of the thinking of laws that were written around things like physically stopping people and overhearing them personally to broader.
No, I mean, I take your point. I take your point that there are certainly some people that are undesirable, right? From a liberal Western perspective, for example, pedophiles, right? Obviously, that's not a good thing. We don't necessarily want to create a network that enables these individuals, but unfortunately, any network that would enable those types of pedophiles or terrorists, which are always the two scapegoats against any kind of digital privacy centric type technology. The thing is, like, for example, in mainland China, a human rights activist would be labeled not as a terrorist, but as someone who is essentially messing with the harmony of the Chinese political system, right? So there are examples where a good 99% of the world's population agrees, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people in power are going to see it that way. And so, I feel like, I guess, unfortunately, this technology kind of, on the client side, I guess there should be a way for me to see something and then label it as obscene, for example, like a beheading video, right? Label it as obscene. And then if 90% of people who viewed this content also labeled it as obscene, maybe it just doesn't show up in my stream anymore, that kind of content, right? So there are ways of using consensus mechanisms that would enable most of the problematic content from surfacing in most people's feeds. But we definitely want to create as free and as open a network as possible. And, going back to, constantly talking about, well, what about pedophiles or terrorists? I mean, what about human rights activists? What about China? What about Iran? What about Saudi Arabia? What about North Korea, Russia? Right? What about all of these countries? And do we want, for example, I mean, it's very interesting because Mikhail Gorbachev was one of the great reformers of the 20th century, and essentially, he collapsed the Soviet Union accidentally by giving the Soviet people free speech, that's what happened. Like, they had free speech. Now suddenly they were allowed to protest in the streets, and then they just constantly protested all the time, and that just collapsed a very corrupt and arguably evil empire, as Reagan called it. I don't necessarily see it that way. I see that it was definitely corrupt because of all the obscurity.
Yeah.
But if we can empower people on the ground to know about things like, for example, organ trafficking in state-run hospitals, right? I wonder how most Chinese people, if they knew that this was happening, how would they feel about that, right? And if the Chinese government was operating in a more transparent environment, would they improve? Could they survive in a more transparent environment? Maybe they could, but and maybe they couldn't. I don't know. But certainly, that is a choice, an option that we want to give to the people in question, rather than to the people in power. So that's just kind of my view on this. Is anytime we talk about censorship, I'm always against it, no matter what, right? Because I don't think that we can use the example of the boogeyman, pedophile, or terrorist to say, well, it's okay that the U.S. government is surveilling everyone and tracking everyone's metadata, and it's okay that the Chinese government is censoring everybody's internet and controlling what information they have access to, right? Like these we don't want these things, obviously.
So,
and using the boogeyman as an excuse to justify this technology, or to say, well, we do still need some controls. I'm not sure if that's really aligned with my view.
I mean, to me, again, it's all about not getting away from relying on these things that we've come to just have as quick fixes. So I think there's a few core ideas that we have outside of it that really align closely with what you're saying. One is the concept of distributed moderation, right? So say we have a distributed Reddit-like application, and anybody can broadcast messages, presuming that they format them correctly, so anyone can build a client that just labels itself distributed Reddit, right? So let's call it Reddit. So here's a Reddit message. I just fire it at the chain. Right? And anyone can build a Reddit server, right? So you could have credit for kids distributed Reddit, Cage Reddit, or whatever. That's a few parents moderate, and they tightly moderate, right? Stuff from that Richard Parris's key is a bit racy. He's got there's breasts. Not for the kids.
Right.
Fine. Yeah. And nothing wrong with that. How you deal with your kids growing up and stuff is fraught, and it's not an easy question. But there's nothing wrong with saying let's curate content for that, right? Similarly, maybe I just want an art Reddit, and so that's all we put up, just because that's all we get. Now, some of it's completely very controversially disturbing imagery and stuff, but we all, as a group, curate that to say, well, is it genuinely art or not? Like, and we have to make hard decisions, like, is a simulation of a beheading video as part of something artistic to demonstrate some horror, is that acceptable or not? What do we think? We have to get down to the real basis of what is our art video community about, what's acceptable. Do we have lines? What are they? So I think that's really one important side of it. And so that gets you to the point where, well, okay, there will be Nazis over there being Nazis, right? And I'm not going to let them on my feed because I really don't like them, and I don't need to even pay attention to what they're saying and give it credit. But there'll be a little echo chamber over there that's full of Nazis being Nazis, and we have to work out as a society, how do we engage with these people, right? why are they Nazis? Do I think that's a normal thing to be, that people would be without some other influences in their lives and the society that's around them?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I think, well, maybe that people pick up views like that, or their views move into extremes like that because of other factors that maybe we can actually mitigate by talking to each other, or actually looking as a society as like, what's going on for these people? Why is anyone that angry?
Right.
Right? But we have to start asking that kind of question. We can't say, oh, look, Twitter, just up the Nazi filter, please, and then think that we've fixed anything.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly with the eternal bogeyman of things like child pornography, this is an on-chain activity if they do it. They signed it. You signed the damn thing, right? So we've given police acting appropriately every tool they can have. If you can find that person, they're 100% prosecutable. If you can show, you've given them the equivalent of digital DNA to find, people, if that's what you want to do. Now, the same would work on a dissident,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it comes down to, we've gone away from thinking that some algorithm can execute this to having to police it. Now, a state like China will always have the ability to police its people. Right? And the question then comes down to what will happen if people have better tools for talking in that society. But I don't think anywhere in the world is going to be like, oh, well, pedophiles. Everywhere is going to prosecute that. And I don't think there's a state in the world that would give people safe haven for that. Now, they wouldn't necessarily block them at a state level, but you have to do these things in public. Right? So like you were saying, you declare, like, Amazon-like provider in I don't know, France, and putting up a public notice that I am no longer taking packets from this set of servers, and I'm no longer working with these sets of keys because they have done this. Right? And I'm telling everybody else I've seen this. Right? And everybody else can make their own decision. Now, if that is child pornography, I'm pretty sure everyone will be like, well, let's get that the fuck off our network.
Right.
And they will chop it pretty quickly. And we can double check if we want. And if someone lies and I say, oh, this George Landry is a terrible guy, he's putting up, I don't know, Islamist propaganda, people can check out what I'm saying and they're like, no, Richard, you're trolling. Don't do that. Right? But you have to check, and you have to take responsibility for things. We can't just say things. And that's why it's just important that it's all done in public. Right? So when you make a declaration, it's not some thing that happens in a bureaucracy somewhere or in a data center somewhere with text managing algorithms that can behave in any way it pleases, because there's no oversight, there's no public kind of control of that. And I think that's the issue we see in a lot of countries. Just trying to protect people from stuff rather than publicly saying it's in a box over there. I've labeled the box bad shit, right? And you're an academic studying the bad shit. Well, that's tough on you because you're exposed to this awful stuff. Yeah. But you've got access to it to do something meritorious. And if I'm your colleague and I think, well, he's not doing that for the right reasons, I can say so. We have a debate about it. But you can't just protect people from it as if it doesn't exist. And that's, I think we've got to get back to some fundamentals on that. And again, it's just about it's not about covering up for anyone or making anything more or less simple to do, because there will always be personal espionage type things people could do to cover their tracks, faking identities, all sorts of stuff. And I mean, leaving aside biometrics and attempts to sort of rein stuff in that way. But we just need to get away from these fanciful ideas that we can fix stuff with a couple of algorithmic tweaks that are deep societal issues that have gone on forever.
Right.
And if we get to stuff that's a real split, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, the world's divided on that. It's complicated. So what we'll see is if Group A and Group B start banning all coverage of it, well, that they don't like, that's going to happen. And if it's done in public, it's obvious to everybody that it's happening. And you just got to rely on the fact there'll be a certain number of people who'll be like, wait, what? Why am I getting such different stories out of both sides? Because I'll know that what's being said over there is being said. it might be being declared as hate speech by groups A, B, and C, but I can still go and check if I think that's really true.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have such fundamental differences, we've got to look beyond blockchain to solve them, or internets to solve them. That's a big question for groups of people and societies to get their heads around. How can we see such so differently, and how can we coexist at that level? Whereas for things, and I think it's right, your bogeyman point, for things that we all just agree are just abhorrent, I think we'll find that there is quite quick consensus to not have any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we'll get to some we'll get to some difficult areas. But I think it's important to be doing the stuff in public rather than hiding it away.
But when it comes to, as you were saying, that on a network that's a blockchain, everything's been signed, and therefore you would be able to track down the person who posted it. I view that as problematic for the simple reason that, as you yourself acknowledged, the same technology that would allow you to track down a pedophile would also allow you to track down a dissident or a human rights activist. And so that's just where, I kind of feel like you almost have to draw a hard line that free speech just cannot necessarily be interfered with, because although, I also recognize, I was talking to a friend of mine, Eric, the other day, and we have this conversation also on YouTube in my channel. One of the main uses for Tor, unfortunately, is just a lot of very dark shit. And that's why Tor kind of gets a bad rap. But man, there still has to be that technology that exists for countries that are currently being ruled by very repressive governments, because what do you like? What is the alternative? That the government just controls all the media outlets and filters the internet, and nothing that they view as uncomplimentary or just that makes them look bad gets to be seen by their people. I mean, that for me, that's more problematic than pedophiles, because I mean, the truth is there's not really that many of them. They get a lot of attention, but I don't know what the percentage of the population is, and it's even an even smaller percentage that actually act out, that actually do anything about it, right? It's abhorrently high in the Catholic priest community, unfortunately, but just if you look at overall in the general population of human beings on planet Earth, there's not really that many people that are willing to blow themselves up for Allah. And there's more than zero, and those people are a real problem, but there's not that many of them. And there's not actually that many pedophiles. There's a lot more abuses of things that we all agree with, like human rights, for example. Like nobody's ever tried to amend the United Nations ratification of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was ratified in 1948. Nobody's come up with a credible intellectual challenge to it. Like, we can all agree on this, all right? And that was the point, right? It's not about, in the United Nations, we all have to fundamentally agree in Jesus or the Buddha or whatever. Like, in order to form a global community, we had to come up with a set of beliefs that everyone could kind of sign up for, and those beliefs that everyone that no one has been able to really credibly challenge are under threat in many, many countries, including Western countries, right? Like government surveillance. There's a lot of very problematic issues, even in the West. So I feel like censorship resistance is, for me, of paramount importance when I'm looking at decentralized content distribution networks.
Yeah. So I think the point to me, again, and yeah, I think you picked up on that, like, oh, people have signed the message. I think the issue there is that's got to be understood in the context of what I was saying about doing things publicly, doing your censorship and things publicly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, like you were saying about the Soviet Union, they said, okay, you can protest. So people protested, and they protested hard, and they kept doing it. And politicians would come out and say, we'll fix it. And people just didn't believe them, right? Because suddenly you could actually talk to your neighbor, and say to them, what do you think? And most people are like, yeah, it's rubbish. They're just corrupt. Don't give them the time of day. I think that there is a straight up issue around censorship resistance, and if one message can get out, so can another. The question is, what happens when we police that, and how do we police that? So if a state is putting in a significant effort to find a small group of people, like you say, the threat is far overblown from most of the media boogeymen out there, compared to, like, if you want to be worried about something, worry about road traffic.
Yeah.
Road traffic causes way more suffering and sorrow in the world than any of these political things we're worried about, in terms of, even wars pale in significance at the moment compared to, just the number of people who lose limbs and parts of their lives, or all of their lives, on roads from careless behavior, etc. This is something we're doing a good job of improving in large parts of the West, but as a world problem overall, cars are still the biggest killer now, well, road traffic. So we are totally perspectiveless on this a lot of the time. And it's because, the Murdoch press, or whoever your bogeyman is, finds it difficult to hype fear of cars.
Right.
Whereas it's very easy to, it's the hacker in the hoodie in a dark room.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's sort of a generally spooky picture, and so it works on people, even though, like, it's got to do with hacking. I sometimes code in a hoodie. I sometimes code in a t-shirt. It doesn't change my ability. Mm-hmm. Certainly the lighting's not important. But there's this imagery plays a big part in people's heads. I'm getting off topic. Getting back to it. No, I think it has to be about people undergoing these processes in as much light of day as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, when it comes to things like dissidents and stuff, we want to throw, of course, any given government can oppress its people. If you have things like police forces and so forth, they can be used or misused to protect or to oppress people. The question is, what do we do about that, and how do we mobilize technologies, to me, to bring that to light?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a general thing. I read this about, and it might be a bit strange, but about, abuse in the home, and was it gendered or not? And it comes down basically, along with a lot of crime, to how likely people think it is that they'll get away with the crime. So upping sentences does nothing, because I'm not going to change my mind about stealing, a bottle of whiskey from a shop, because I'm going to get 5 years rather than 1. There's no way I'm going to steal whiskey if I think I'm going to get 1 year, if it's a 50-50 chance. Right. So upping it to 5 doesn't make any difference. My thought is purely, do I think I'll get caught? Mm-hmm. And I think the same sort of thinking plays out. There's something you're doing if you're oppressing people, right, that erodes you long term. Mm-hmm. It erodes you in the eyes of others, and it undermines long term your own institutions and your own abilities. Mm-hmm. And so shining as much light on that is the important thing. And that's where the difference is, right? If you are running a sting operation on a pedophile ring running child pornography, mm-hmm. if you're doing those things, that's hard on the people who have to do it. But they can get support and hopefully, sort of the help they need that might come from doing something that they feel from, the institutions around them and the people and family around them. And people can say, you're doing a good job. It's horrible. You have to do that. Probably an HR thing. You should have a limit to how people can do such jobs, because they are damaging, like the poor people at Facebook who go through the dark stuff there. The difference is that you can do that. Whereas if what you're doing is oppressing people, if you're just shutting people down locking them up and imprisoning them, which frankly a blockchain is not going to change. What it can change is the dynamics of how openly you have to do that, how publicly you have to show off what you're doing. And that's why I think you get this snowball effect in countries that do this kind of thing, where they have to block and control more and more and more. Because it's not just doing X, it's the fact that, oh, then, you know, people have phones, so you've got to stop them taking photos of you doing X. And then people start doing other stuff, like looking at records and, why are you buying so much concrete and razor wire? What's it for?
Right.
You know, you can't possibly, you know, like pig farms, I don't believe you. And so you have to start locking down on that information. And the hope there really is that by forcing this to be as obvious as you can, you erode these things from the inside, and you make it, you amplify the negatives to the people doing this. Right? You're not going to fix stuff immediately. And if you did have, I mean, you've seen it in places where there were sudden mass protests in Egypt and other places where the state simply turns off the internet.
Yeah.
The point is, you look pretty weak when you have to do that. Part of China's mastery of its control of the internet is that it's let people have these rich Chinese-centric internet lives that they can't tell from what they could have. Right? So everyone's still just in love with WeChat and buying stuff, and it comes 4 minutes later, and, you know, being able to order from any number of 400 restaurants and chat with grandma and everything. And so we're also, you know, so in love with that people aren't getting a deep sense of, well, this is just shitty compared to what it could be. And that's one of those places where I think that's actually, like you were saying, is very easy in the West to look at this stuff and say, oh, there's nothing like that. Now, I think they're very different in terms of the moral level of how problematic they are. But there are also all these controls, and we have similar loss from centralization and central control in the West, that content, you know, is pushed to becoming blander. And we're protected away from things that I think, you know, are quite often important in terms of censoring things like literature. I mean, it's just, to me, that's just utterly problematic. Because the idea of censoring things like books is just absurd.
Right.
Putting big stickers on them saying "warning," there's lots of nasty in here, fine, but you shouldn't stop people going and opening them up. And so I think it's a spectrum. It's not like there's none of that in the West. It's just very, I mean, its character and morality is very different where it's happening in places like China and Venezuela to a degree, and I mean lots of Middle Eastern states and other places that have this very strong control of their media. I think the thing is that you know, freedom will out, truth will out, and so just shining light as hard as you can on things is the important thing. So when people are silencing others, to make it as obvious as possible. And then it's up to people to judge my actions if I'm silencing someone.
Right.
Like, you know, I can't hide from the fact that I did it. Now, I might get praise because maybe that person was being really, really problematic for everybody. Right? But it should be open so that people can make their judgment, rather than I can sit in an office and do it with no consequences for myself, particularly when there's and the real problem here is you know, the Germans had a word for the worst of the Nazis is Schreibtischtöter, right? People who killed from their desk. And to me, the coldest, scariest thing is when these things happen, not necessarily killing, but there's collateral damage. Right. So in order to stop, as you was pointing out this year, very small number of global jihadis from doing stuff, realistically small number, we just wipe out whole aspects of human behavior because, oh, well, you know, who cares about people, you know, communicating freely? We needed to get rid of these 17 people. And that's where we, you know, with those accidental sidelines where, I mean, a very simple case for me is, you see it in banking is a place where this happens a lot, where regulations, they're declaring things like money laundering for activities that involve no laundering of money that I can see. They might be breaching regulation, but there are cases where I would be breaching money laundering law to take my tax earned money from one place and send it to myself in another jurisdiction where I've paid all the taxes I'm due, but I'm not allowed to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? How the hell did that happen? Like, maybe tick a box in a form or something, but the idea that if I just did it myself, that's I'm now breaking some kind of international law just for sending myself my own money. That's a bit odd. Now, if there's laundering involved, if I sold a bunch of cocaine and used some international channels to buy some guns with it,
Mm-hmm.
on the way through, I turned it into more legit money through a casino somewhere. Fine, investigate that, but like I said, do it by proper policing channels and look into those things properly. Don't think that there's some simple office-based solution for we'll just ban all these behaviors and then that's fine.
Right. But even when it comes to, tax evasion and terrorism, it's interesting. I mean, I was watching a documentary on Netflix a couple of weeks ago called Drone. And it was made in 2014, I think. And it was really interesting because it brings up the point that a lot of these drone strikes they were talking about a specific region in Pakistan. And there were some human rights activists on the ground kind of documenting a lot of these drone strikes and the collateral damage that they cause. And it was interesting because, none of the people that got hit by a drone strike were taken to some kind of public court where any burden of proof was met before they were convicted of even jaywalking, right? And without any due process whatsoever, some people, mainly lawyers at the CIA, authorized a drone strike from the U.S. Air Force base, I think in Creech or something. I forget exactly the specifics, but they just authorized a drone strike from 10,000 miles away. And the result is, well, if I'm a poor person in Pakistan who's got the fear of God placed into me by this idea that I might get drone striked at any point, I might not think so kindly about the United States, for example, right? And that these programs might actually be creating the very enemies that they're supposed to be fighting. And when it comes to tax evasion, I mean, I wonder if I was an American, and I'm not, would it really be moral for me to support those kind of initiatives by actually paying my taxes? Right? So, and there's also a great Andreas Antonopoulos talk about black markets, right? For example, he mentions, for example, Uber is in many cities, in many markets where it operates, Uber is a black market. But the thing is, it offers a more transparent service with better ratings of drivers. And sure, there's anecdotal, stories about Uber drivers doing atrocious things, but they're cheaper. It doesn't cost $200,000 to get a taxi medallion to drive an Uber, right? So they're cheaper, and in many cases, they're better, they're faster, they're more reliable. So, all of these things that the mainstream views as illegal, perhaps, but immoral, I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of open questions there when you understand kind of some of the realities on the ground. And I think that having that understanding or having a content distribution that allows really for all the facts to be shown, that really allows for a better basis to form a social consensus, is a very necessary technology. This is a very desirable thing that I really hope gets developed. But my primary source of pessimism is I just don't see anybody with a lot of money like for example, Google Ventures, right? I don't see them being particularly interested in destroying their own business, right? I don't know. I mean, I wonder. And also the really scary thing is, for example, in China, you have this social credit score that is incredibly repressive when you think about it. But according to some statistics on the ground, I think something like 80% of Chinese people are actually in favor of it, right? So,
that's probably a whole podcast unto itself. But I mean, I think that's actually something that's really radically misunderstood. I think it's actually, I mean, most Chinese people are just happy. And this is a quote from paraphrasing someone I've forgotten saying, but like most people in China are just super happy that there's now something that can be done about the guy who's like smoking next to them in the train.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, we have social credit, and we have had at the DMV or the Vic Roads, it is in my hometown. We've had a social credit point scheme for ages about driving. Right. You lose 12 points, you can't drive.
Right.
And none of us think that's a bad thing. And that's a lot of what's happening in China. So if you have like fines you haven't paid, so instead of jailing you, which is what they do in Australia, you can't get trains and planes. Right.
Yeah.
If you've avoided taxes and stuff, you can't book first and business class tickets. Right. So to me, the issue isn't, is it better or worse? I think again, it comes back to these ideas of having these oversimple ways of dealing with human problems. Right. So you try and algorithmically manage behavior with 1.2 billion people. Well, let's make it simpler. 1 million people. It's not going to work. Right. You'll have these edge cases of horrific, or somewhere between just unfortunate and horrific misapplication. Have we lost the connection?
We lost it temporarily, but you're back now.
Yeah. So what I was saying is you'll end up with these cases where those things get misapplied, right? And you got to ask yourself, what is the overall benefit versus the loss of what you have for that? And when it comes to things like liberty, I don't think it's okay to be like, well, we accidentally jail 1 in every 100 people, but the streets are clean. To me, that's the problem, is you go in that direction. You get lazy instead of dealing with behavior one-on-one and doing real policing, where, for instance, in neighborhoods and stuff, the police get what's going on. They understand the difference between the kid that just threw the rocks, dad just died, or is just being an idiot, right? And I get that. And so you can actually respond appropriately across the board. You end up with, the problem with these things is that making it numerical, and we do have a good instinct to say, oh, that's horrific, because of where it can go, and because of the potential. I mean, I think the classic thing is a much talked about Black Mirror episode of someone I haven't actually seen it, not having enough social credit of some kind or another to get on a plane and can't make a wedding or something.
Yeah.
And that the fact that it turns into unfeeling bureaucracy. And I think anyone who wants to understand that, come to China. I don't know if it's getting popular anywhere else, but come to a Chinese restaurant where you now order on a tablet.
Yeah.
Right. And the first time you think, that's interesting. And if you're into tech, you're like, oh, fun buttons. And I wonder how they've done the UX on this, etc. Until the first time you're like, could I have this, but I want it a bit cooler, like, because I've got a baby and I don't want it to burn her mouth. Or can I have this but no sugar or no MSG? Whatever. Tablet doesn't understand. Tablet has no way of nuanced stuff.
Right.
Like, so, like, you're just dealing with this implacable thing. And you have to think, do I want the thing as it is or not? And there's no ability to interact in a human way. It might be the simplest request.
Yeah, but one kind of problem with that is that in many cases the human interaction will just say yes, sure, no problem, right? Like
it's not perfect. I'm just saying, as an example of what it can be like dealing with, like in some cases the tablet is better, but but if you've dealt with the frustrations of like thinking, how can I do this thing? Maybe I'm in a hurry. I just want to ask, like, how long does the noodles take? No, you're right. They might just say, 5 minutes and not really think about it. but there's no way the tablet can even try and do that. And when you start making law, or like, when judges essentially are doing that, like, like the drone strike, kill, no kill, this is not okay, right? And I think that's the problem with this, trying to codify law into kind of algorithms on how to treat people, whether they're bureaucratic algorithms or computational. That's where we get into these real problems. And I think we also get away from, we disconnect any sense of morality, like you're pointing out, from these decisions that just become pragmatic decisions, which they aren't. That's not what they are. They require more of us than just taking these simple, pragmatic, mechanistic approaches to things.
Yeah. So I guess to wrap things up, I just want to get your take on, Web 3.0, and what is your great hope for it? Like, if you could wave a magic wand, what would Web 3.0 essentially do for the world? How would it change the human condition, in your opinion?
So I think it'll touch on a lot of the things we've been talking about. So for content itself, let's just think of artistic content rather than structured speech. I just think we've seen, I grew up in a town with a fantastic community radio station. And doing that, you just got exposure to so much more, not just music, but, different artistic projects and different cultural things. It was just a great resource in that town, and people were drawn to it. It became a community, and it flourished. And life would be very different in the city without that. So that's one thing we'll see, is the ability to have these global versions of community radio stations, right? Where we can slice and dice the demographic groups, the populations, the user bases around the world, with the web as it started, but all the people into a very obscure band around the world can find each other. People who collect a very specific kind of baseball card can all find each other, whatever it is. So we'll get that, and we'll just get exposed to very different cultural output that's genuine. And I think for those sorts of things, the closer to the artist that it is, the better it gets. Now, there are some artists who are simply not very good, and so you'll get a lot of dross out there as well. But you have to have the million people trying to get those 10 things that you yourself find inspiring. And that's one huge thing that we'll get. I think we'll see something similar from development and from software and the way we interact with the internet itself, which will be because the burdens to developing and to creating things just being lower means that we'll have the kind of second open source revolution where people will understand, hey, look, there's Facebook kind of things, but I can have, there's many different client implementations of this that have different feature sets and different content for different reasons that work slightly differently. Similarly, I could have TwitFace, which is a weird combination of Facebook and Twitter that someone's written that has those things in it, and or perfectly secure private messaging. Somebody else might just want a blast of pop culture out of a differently structured app. So we'll have this development will be able to work in this very different model where, because we're able to disintermediate all that money, there'll be a lot more small pies, and hopefully those small pies will be much more interesting and delicious and handmade than the giant factory pie we get our piece of now. Right. It's just the same for everybody pretty much. Good quality, and to try and push that metaphor harder and further, an improvement over the sometimes sand-filled, sometimes bird-eaten fruit pies we had before to something reliable, but still losing a lot in its sort of texture and quality. So I think that will then happen at the development level, and then I think a third layer will be. And we've seen people pushing on this hard as well, because places like fintech, it becomes important quickly. And also finance is a kind of subset that's numerical, so easier to deal with. But things like providing equal quality services to people who are unbanked now around the world that the rest of us hopefully get in our first world enclaves. Having things like more autonomy to sort of leave financial providers and shift and move, etc. Those things I think will have a very real impact on people's lives, because of course these things are structured such that if you're capable and aware of what you're doing and have some money, there'll be someone who'll be receptive to you coming and using their services, and you'll be able to avail yourself of tools like the law to get your money out of such scenarios where you're not happy what it's doing. Whereas if you're at the bottom of the income spectrum or unbanked, you don't have any of those options.
Right.
Your best hope might be a local money lender. So being able to have all of that restructure, and that someone who's starting a small enterprise in South Sudan has the ability to put their profit somewhere safe, right, and then to leverage them or to capitalize somebody else's business, and that to me is a huge part of the structural inequality we see in the world today. And I think that's another big part of where Web 3.0 can help things, is by bringing the autonomy, sovereignty that people can have in decentralized spaces readily to people, such that I can offer you a service, and that's great, but I can't tie you into that service. That's also going to be a huge improver, I think, for quality of service provision and so forth, just lubricating those processes of changing provider, of finding a new provider, of having access to a provider.
Right. So more choice, lower barriers to entry, and lower barriers to access.
Right. So it's both sides. It's that at the user level, I have a simpler road to swapping. It's always up to me. I can't be locked in, etc., by circumstance. And then at the provider level, that it's also easier to build up these services. I mean, and just how Bitcoin works when it works. Ignoring scaling issues, but just looking at what having your money on a key pair does for you. That be your own bank thing is true. So I'm far more empowered in that situation to just take my stuff and go somewhere else. No one can stop me. And so I'm not going to be stuck by small terms and conditions or other things. Similarly, what's really important is actually that the banking bit's taken care of. So people who build software can concentrate on making it do the servicey things they need, not actually how do you secure the money. That's all taken care of. So the burden for writing a very advanced financial services tool on Bitcoin versus the financial system is tiny. And that's where the real possibility of differences comes. So we've seen things like crypto exchanges just pop up. Whereas things like the NYSE used to be a big deal. There used to be a big, and unique technology deployment that was sort of revered for its quality and stuff. And then you see something like Binance come up and be much more functional, much more options in a year. And that's been chasing the money and the hype. But if we think about, well, it took HSBC or Bank of America or whatever this long to make that web portal and to build up their set of services and so forth. Think of them as the NYSE, and your new banking options as Binance. Like when people put the same effort into like just making better interactive tools for people to get about their daily life with things like their money, we'll see a very different world, I think.
Yeah. One of the things that I find super exciting about this technology is if you're, for example, you have Signal. I don't know if you know Signal, Open Whisper systems.
I don't know Signal. Yeah.
So they advertise, end-to-end encryption. But one of the issues that is kind of immediately obvious to me is, sure, I get end-to-end encryption, but the system administrator at Signal, if he or she is looking, can still see when I sent a message, who I sent it to, how many messages I've been sending and receiving, right? All that metadata
Yeah.
is not at all obfuscated. And then the other major problem that is, again, immediately obvious is, how exactly is Signal paying for this infrastructure, right? They're open source, they're the good guys. But in order to sustain a network with, potentially millions of users, you have to have some kind of data center somewhere, and you have to be paying for the pipes, the internet bandwidth, and you have to be paying for all that hardware that's routing all of these messages, even if they're really end-to-end encrypted. And so it's very difficult for me to just blindly trust that Open Whisper is actually as secure as they claim to be, or as they market themselves as being, because they have costs of operation. Whereas with this Web 3.0 technology that we're talking about, the infrastructure is decentralized. If you just write some software, you can distribute it, and you don't have to pay for any infrastructure. So that, I think, that right there is one of the biggest game changers, is the fact that these decentralized systems have no infrastructure cost to the developers.
It's really critical. I mean, I was mentioning that before with the sort of the you can just launch stuff on to the network, and the infrastructure is a self-sustaining PKI network. So it just, if your product generates enough revenue from its activity, then it will live on that network without you needing to think about the scaling costs, etc. I think the other interesting thing there, of course, is that you're talking about the metadata leakage out of using something like Signal. And of course, a blockchain, it can be even worse, because like I said, it's assign the message, right?
Right.
So that's what's really important. Things like, well, with Saito, I think we've got something very different on our hands there, and the real innovation that we have is because we have that arbitrary size on the op return field. So the message portion of your transaction is arbitrarily big. You could put another transaction in there, and you can put a transaction in that. So you can very quickly do things like onion route or mixed networks. Right. So it's quite simple to do things like set up a consortium with people who I'll just, like you were saying with the torrents before, I will just take your message, unwrap it, right? And so we've set up encryption. So you multi-layer encryption. So I can't see what's in there. And similar to that card shuffling algorithm I was talking about before, you can have ways of just sending the messages into a swarm and then have them all come out again. Now we haven't specifically been building on that, but we've thought quite a bit about the possibility of doing it and making sure that's possible. And that's really vital, along with other privacy tools that we may want to, well, developers will be able to add in along the lines of, snarks and other things, where you can use zero knowledge proof to sort of demonstrate things came from an address without saying the address, etc. And so it's really important to us that we give people the tools to do that kind of thing, because there's actually privacy and security are not the same thing, and it's very easy for people to kind of figure that they both are. And blockchains can be supremely leaky on the privacy side because the public nature of all the metadata. So what's important to us is that we give people a suite that they can work with. So if I'm doing something like tweeting, I want to stamp my key onto all my tweets and throw them at the world so that they're genuinely mine. And they're public. I want them to be visible. Whereas, yes, if you and I are having a private conversation, and we're not particularly keen on people knowing that it's you and me communicating, we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we structure the internal routing to make that less obvious than my key sent your key a message.
Yeah. One of the things that I was working on back in 2013, 2014, when I met your partner, David Lancashire, was I was working on a BitMessage client.
Right.
And BitMessage was interesting. I mean, it was kind of retarded the way that it worked, but it was I would call it the sledgehammer of security, because
Right.
the way that it essentially worked is you would encrypt a message with someone's public key, and so only their private key could decrypt the message. And then you would send that message over a blockchain. So everybody would replicate the encrypted version of the message. Everybody would upload it. Everybody would download it. And so from the outside looking in, you had no idea who was corresponding with who, because everybody was uploading and everybody was downloading every single message, right? So you completely obfuscated all metadata over that network. But, some of the drawbacks with that, for example, in order to prevent spam, you had a proof of work component. So if you wanted to attach a file to a text message, for example, on my MacBook Pro, which is a quad-core i7 with hyper-threading, so it handles 8 concurrent threads, I think it took me like 15 minutes to attach a 1 megabyte file. So it just...
It's nearly as bad as trying to send a Zcash transaction.
Yeah, it was basically like, in order for Bitmessage to be useful, you'd have to accept, the 1993 version of the internet, right? Like dial-up speeds or even worse. So the community abandoned that protocol, unfortunately, and then I kind of hung in there for a while. But yeah, that's definitely one way that you can obfuscate all the metadata. But Tor does it more precisely. But there's some problems with, do you trust the exit nodes, and some other issues there. And then can you, if Tor was more capable, like could you multipath a connection so that some packets would go over some routes and other packets would go over other routes, and then that would be interesting if it was more capable and more developed. But it's a question of, there's not a lot of developers who every developer really loves open source. In my experience, they think open source is cool. They think open source is amazing. But then when you ask them, so what open source projects are you currently writing code for? Right? None, because I work full time and I make $100,000 a year, and I don't actually really fundamentally, I don't really give a shit about open source. I just like talking about it. So that's kind of where my only source of pessimism with this technology is that some very, very smart people are essentially going to have to work for free on this stuff, because I don't see who has an incentive in building it right now. It's not obvious to me who wants to build this.
Are you talking about the infrastructure layer at the bottom, or these kinds of tools that then use that to do things like mixed networks for messaging, etc.?
All of it. The underlying infrastructure for decentralized, peer-to-peer networking, all of the open source stuff right now. It's all, Tor is cool because you can just download the Tor bundle and then it works sometimes. It doesn't work at all.
I understand as well, that was a government project initially.
So. Yeah, exactly. It was government funded. It was funded by DARPA. Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and they built it to secure their own communications. Mm-hmm. And, but then I guess they stopped really funding it, and it hasn't really been developing. It's not getting much better than it was 5 years ago. It's still basically the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, wearing my Saito hat, that's solving that problem is what we're on about, and it's mm-hmm. 2 parts. Mm-hmm. One is we are a public PKI network that you can start building these tools on, and we obviously need to stay funded and things, but we're working on that. Mm-hmm. And we'd love people to come in and assist. Mm-hmm. And then the second level is, I think that business model we were talking about earlier is the key to getting more apps, etc., available. And the difference is that initially only a few people will want the extra delays and costs and so forth around, mix routing everything they send.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's a group of them, you can develop for them and you have some kind of revenue stream. So you have to work out
right.
how to meet those people's needs and how much it's going to cost. But you've got a much better shot at that being true. The big question that I think you've raised, and that really is an outstanding question, is, can we convince the big players that they need to be part of this because it will happen, and they want to be in the vanguard, not catching up from behind, right?
Right.
And that's a really next big challenge for us as a project is, can we get the bigger players to understand what we're doing, to understand why scaling is economic in nature at the first place, why they want to be part of this revolution, and that their things like their advertising oligopoly is on the way out already.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It doesn't look like the beach is eroding wave by wave, but it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And your choice is to, wait for the evidence that you can see, in which case, you've basically reached an unstable, untenable point, or to think about it, to listen and, think critically about what we're saying and actually come to see, these things are important and we need to get to understand, to help build and to start working on this now so that we can be leading lights in this new field, because otherwise we don't have a future. It may not be. The problem is just that people expect constant growth and improvement. And the honest truth is that for Google and Amazon and Facebook, their positions will be diminished in this future world in terms of complete dominance.
Mm-hmm.
Question is, what's their attitude towards survival? And can they actually swallow the pill that, the business model, like the record industry, the business model that created and sustained you is going away.
Mm-hmm.
Can you adapt and do something useful in this new model or not? Because you don't have the choice of keeping things like they are.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big risks in the industry is people using existing legislation and rules, etc., to try and claw back progress.
Mm-hmm.
by with litigation and other methods. You see it in fintech all the time. So using the current regulation to kind of batter away innovative blockchain-based projects, because just adoption of Bitcoin for that matter, by recognizing things like it doesn't comply to existing rules that were written to avoid things that you can't even do with Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
That were just regulatory requirements for banks, right?
Yeah.
Like making up money.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm a bank, I just report how much money I have. So you need auditing rules. Whereas that's not true if you do everything on chain. You just need to read the chain.
Mm-hmm.
But you can still use that law to stop people from developing in the space and from providing products in the space. And that's the dark, not the dark side. The biggest negative I see is a lot of behavior like that, because people can't see that things are changing and they need to get on board for the newer, and they need to start working now to be part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still hopeful that we get some incumbent, there might be people we don't expect, but some large incumbent internet companies will come on board over the next couple of years, because somewhere deep inside they get it, that there's enough technical and or just, I don't know, visionary, how you describe it, but people who are aware, capable of introspection, capable of analysis, who will look at trends and say, what, the same thing that made us, the same kind of big disruptive changes that happened that created our business are happening again, and we better be ready for this, or we're going to be a dinosaur and we're going to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll see some surprising things. In the same way that we see Microsoft being surprisingly good open source citizens at the moment. They're a company that have no soul, no character, so that could change back at any time.
Right.
But it's also still surprising for someone like me, who was attending Linux meetups in 1995, old ale, to see Microsoft, remembers the Bulma, open source as a virus kind of tirades.
Yeah, the October letters, all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so remembering that, you're sort of hard to believe that Microsoft is doing a decent job stewarding stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and opening a lot of their things up, and that they have a Linux distribution that they run now and stuff. It just seems uncanny, but I think we will see some possibly unexpected groups recognizing that somewhere between greed and self survival, they'll come on board and say, you know, and that is a huge victory yet to be won.
Mm-hmm.
And it also won't be simple. It won't be a matter of, oh, they're on our side now, that's great. It'll be a matter of them having to work out how to participate, and communities having to work out how they interact with that participation. And because they'll be lumbering sort of oaths at first because they won't get it.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be like, okay, we see what you're saying, we've come to interact, and then just do all the wrong things because their instincts and their internals will be set up all wrong. And so, we're going to see a lot of that as well.
Yeah, it's for now, it's definitely an uphill battle, I think.
I mean, definitely, and obviously incumbents are incumbent. They have a lot of interest to protect.
Yeah.
And again, somewhere between diligently, vouchsafing their assets and value of their shareholders and other stakeholders through to sort of callow self-interest. They've got to act carefully. They've got things to think about. It's not like they can just say, oh, it's just going to happen, let's just do that. But I really do hope that we see enough constant progress on the fintech side, on the general data network side of blockchain, more and more victories. And I think Saito's got a lot of those nascently, coming along. That it'll be step by step. But we'll look back this time next year and this time the year after and think, wow, that's a pretty quick change and pretty rapid.
Right.
Acceptance.
Well, I hope so. I hope it all works out for you. And let me know when you have your anything that you want me to test out, or I'm more than happy to be on the test net for whatever you guys are working on. Was there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I mean we've been going a good while now. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
No, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you making the time for it. Anytime you wanna do this again, let me know.
Yeah. So I just realized I've got I've got this Dell laptop with the camera right at the bottom here, so you can just see part of the screen, and I'm bouncing a little bit because to get a good angle on me, I had to sit on the bed in this hotel room, so I'm kind of a bit.
No, don't worry. It's fine. It's fine. I mean, this is the resolution on this is pretty okay, and you were pretty. The angle is good. Everything was good. The sound was great. So, again, I appreciate the setup. I appreciate the time you allocated to this. And thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Okay, so have a great weekend.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.